Started. We do have 5 of us, which is a quorum. We got a lot on the agenda, so let's get this show on the road. Let's start out with introductions. Doug.
Doug Carmen, District 2.
Scott.
Scott Nelson, District 3.
Don.
Don DeHaan, District 1.
And Eric.
Eric Casino, District 2.
And I'm Jim Simmons, District 3. And hopefully somebody else will come on if they choose. So, I needed can we get somebody to make a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Any discussions? All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? And next, can I get for approval of the meeting minutes?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor of approval of the meeting minutes?
And probably need some discussion.
Oh, go ahead.
Item 3. I don't think Commissioner Nelson DeHaan seconded it.
Okay.
Either Don or Scott did, one of the two.
Give it to Dawn.
Sorry about that. I'll get that fixed.
No worries. So do we have an approval to accept the meeting minutes of March 3rd as amended?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, doke. So we're going to the public communications phase. For the participants, if you're new, raise your hand or something and we will get to you. Remember, you have 3 minutes to share your thoughts, and Polly will put up a timer. It'll go from green to yellow. When it gets to the yellow, you have 30 seconds and then when it gets to the red, I'm just asked for you to wrap up your thoughts at that point. So I have Patrick Townsend. Looks like you're at the top.
Commissioners, good evening. Patrick Townsend, Shoreline property owner in Boston Harbor. Catching up here a little bit. I've missed a couple of meetings, but I pulled the latest version of the proposed SMP from the website and took a look at it. Personally, I'm shocked to see things like section 19600 115 B3I proposing the unrestricted use of feeds, herbicides, antibiotics, growth stimulants, and other unnamed chemicals as a part of the SMP. Fish and shellfish are already suffering contamination in Puget Sound. The use of plastics that are being proposed are not even marine grade plastics. We now know how toxic they are. That was a part of the Army Corps lawsuit. That issue was upheld as being problematic. And it sounds to me like Love Canal. When I look at this kind of proposed use of chemicals, authorized use, it's just astounding, really, what's being proposed. What will the county say to people who kayak and canoe in these kinds of waters? What will it say to parents whose children are swimming in these waters? What will the Seattle chefs have to say about the use of these kind of chemicals? They've already weighed in on this. Yeah. So it's just astounding to see this in the proposed SMP. So really, it's quite disturbing, and I think that I hope that the Planning Commission will look at this and realize what will happen when citizens of Thurston County begin to see this kind of activity. It's unclear how this will unravel in the future. It's going to be an incredible challenge. Personally, some of you on the Planning Commission were a part of the stakeholder group This whole process started with a technical working group, which included state agencies, Thurston County folks, and a shellfish employee on the technical committee. This was completely unacceptable, of course, to a lot of folks, a lot of citizens in the county, and the stakeholder group was started and then terminated early with no explanation. And I think what we're seeing is the result of this kind of activity. So in the end, I think that this SMP cannot get the support of a broad set of people in Thurston County. I'm hoping that as commissioners, you will think hard about putting your names on this. It's not too late to put a stop to this and to redo it right. It's really not too late at all. And I would just encourage that. That I think the people of Thurston County deserve something better. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. John Woodford.
Good evening, commissioners. I'm John Woodford from Long Lake, and I'm going to just start off by saying I support everything that Patrick Townsend just said. I was also a part of the stakeholder groups that were terminated back in May of 2018, and with no reason at all given, they were never resumed once Brad finished writing the SMP. And I find that a very appalling situation. As to, I'll be brief. I'm just going to talk about the next 3 or 4 pages of the SMP. Last meeting, you ended with chapter 19600 C10, and the next item is P, about covered moorage, and I don't see why that applies at all on non-salmon bearing lakes. And it in fact says that in new single family residential moorage is prohibited. I see no reason why this should be. There are a number of similar kind of things that go on in that section, including spacing of pilings. And if you remember, it's been several meetings ago now, I submitted this is a sketch plan of my own dock, which shows 6 and 8 foot spacing of pilings. And it's actually quite a modest lake for a modest dock for lakes. And I don't see why there's any limitation on spacing of pilings on a freshwater lake. There are lots of other things that again don't apply to lakes, like the orientation of piers. It says that new piers must be oriented in a straight line. It should be in a north-south orientation, etc. I see no reason for this on freshwater lakes. Anyway, and the size of floats, recreational floats, etc. I think these are all issues you're going to be talking about, so I won't go any further with it, but please consider that on freshwater lakes. And also what Patrick said about chemicals, etc., and the stoppage of the stakeholder meetings. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, sir. Lynn Lanowet.
So this is Bob Lanowet using Lynn Lanowet's computer. Can you hear me
Write
okay?
that down.
That's all right. I'm a resident of Thurston County. I live on Long Lake. I have a couple things I want to share with you. One, I mentioned before about the shoreline management program plan having dimensions included in the plan, where I don't think the regulation is necessarily going to get the dimensions correct. And I would like rather see some language in there that would say your dock, for instance, would be susceptible to approval by the planning or the planners or something, where you would bring your proposal and then it would be approved by them. I don't know why you would limit in this document, as John said, the spacing of pilings, whatever, and the size of the dock, et cetera, et cetera. The second thing I want to mention is I do appreciate the effort that is ongoing of reviewing the SMP, where you go through each section and provide input and modifications. And I think that's a worthwhile effort. What I'm not hearing about, and I think if I was on the Planning Commission, would be some discussion of the user booklet that would go along with the document. The document is extensive, it's complicated, it's, I don't think the average homeowner is going to understand it and are gonna either ignore it, do something wrong, or have to hire somebody to interpret it for them. So I would suggest some effort be undertaken on the a user-friendly pamphlet that would go along with it and would be published at the same time that the SMP would be published. If we're not going to pursue the pamphlet, then that should be stated and by the staff, and you should approve it or disapprove it. But I, having worked in government for some time, I know that things can be complicated, and I also know if you want to have the public understand it, you have to make a user-friendly document that goes along with it. So thank you very much, and I'll enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you, sir. Phyllis Farrell.
Good evening, commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I've spoken many times before regarding the SMP, along with others that have had concerns about shoreline ecological function, and it's been discouraging how little has been reflected despite all of the public comments in the draft plan. It's very discouraging. We've been following this for years, and specifically, I guess I would ask you to ask staff that the law requires that no net loss be a standard. And I failed to see any language regarding metrics there and the amount of loss that we have had since the last plan was adopted. I would really encourage you to ask about that. We're made lots of comments about protecting buffers and industrial aquaculture practices, specifically the use of chemicals and plastics and hydraulic harvesting. None of that has been reflected in the draft plan. The Puget Sound Partnership and the Orca Task Force recommend reduction in armoring. What specific strategies or plans are in the draft plan to reduce armoring, and how does the plan provide for climate change projections and sea level rise? So I guess I would like to urge you again to consider all of the public comments that have been made on these topics. And, how is the public, this is our opportunity to provide input. And if it's not being listened to or reflected in the draft plan, the process isn't working. So I would urge you to consider all of the comments that have been heard and get some of those recommendations in the plan. Thank you.
Thanks, Phyllis. I'm not seeing any other hands up. Is there anybody else in attendance that would, oops, one just came up. I have C. Oops. C. Went away. Okay, C's gone. How about call-in user?
You can press star 6. You are unmuted.
Hello, this is, oh, we got an echo. Sorry.
There, is that better? Hi, this is Christy White from the Delphi Valley. Just wanted to comment on a couple of things. Can you hear me all right?
You're fine. We got you, Chrissy.
Okay. Thank you. One, on the previous speaker who talked about a pamphlet, I think that is just an outstanding idea for so many things that we do in the county that are so complex, and to encourage you all to think about that in so many things that is presented to the public, that these helpful pamphlets come along. I think that's a great idea. The other thing is regarding the previous speaker as well, that, you know, we look at all the comments that are presented and really take to heart a balanced approach, measuring all comments involved in a project. So the other thing I wanted to talk to you about tonight was, I know this is not on the docket yet, but it's coming, and that's regarding the rezoning of Beaver Creek land to rural resource industrial. I think that that is a project that is going to take an enormous amount of staff FTE time. It's already looked at over half an FTE of staff, and that's not something to put on the docket. The Beaver Creek, it has wetlands. It has already been listed as only fair water quality back in 2016, and to put a warehouse on that land with all that it involves, it's got frogs, it's got a whole lot of things. Do we really need another warehouse along the I-5 corridor? And particularly when you look at Chapter 20.29.010, which involves rezoning to a rural resource industrial, the intent of that is for lands to be developed, if they are rezoned, to support agriculture. I highly doubt that that zoning change and that warehouse would be used for rural activities to support. It's going to be another Amazon or whatever, or maybe it's even being built to handle mineral activities. So I'm just wanting to put this out there. I mean, it's 390 acres. It is a huge piece of property, and encourage you to look at this closely and that it not be put on the docket at this time. So thank you.
Thanks for your input. I have one other. I don't know if this is a duplicate. It just says C.
That's me.
Okay, thanks, Chrissy. Is it? Okay, so is there anybody else who'd like to share? Going once? Going twice? Going 3 times? We're moving on. Oops, nope, that was done. Okay, so we're headed down the agenda. Our next thing is the bio discussion. And I will turn this over to Jennifer to have that, get us going on that.
And I'll quickly turn it back to y'all because what we did was we took your input and crafted, well, Polly helped out, and we created a template, and then we sent it out to you via email. That could be sort of a short, maybe half-page long bio that you would fill out. And so now's the time to discuss what was emailed to you, and if the categories and the things seem correct on there, and if that's something you want to pursue. And if it is, we could finalize it and send it back out for you to fill out and then submit back to us. It would be a public record. It might be something that we post on the Planning Commission webpage, but it's certainly for you all to learn about each other as well, which is, I think, the original direction from the Planning Commission or interest that was expressed. So I'll turn it over to you to discuss if you want to make any changes to that template or add categories or take things away. Go for it.
So any thoughts from you guys? Or are we just gonna run with what we got?
I'm not sure we would want to put an address in there, and I don't know that that's what you meant, Jennifer, when you, under item 3. But that could be just district or area or where you are in the kind of. in the
Yeah.
county.
Totally up to you how much detail you want to give. I live on Long Lake. I live in South Thurston County. I live in City of Olympia. Totally would be up to your level of comfort. We wouldn't be putting your personal address in there.
Sure. But we could maybe in that spot also say what district you're in, because under item 2, it might be at large, but what physical district do you actually live in? Other than that, I think it looks fine.
It's pretty basic stuff, and to Doug's comment, I wouldn't put anything personal in there as far as addresses or phone numbers and that kind of stuff. I don't think you want people outside of your homes holding signs. So, keep it generic basically. And I think it should be fine. I think this is a good idea. Do we have a timeline, Jennifer?
At the discretion of the Planning Commission.
Guys have any thoughts on that? How soon you're capable of getting to it, or like Eric, I know you're not doing anything, but.
I could certainly get it in before the next meeting. 2 weeks to do one page doesn't seem like a huge burden.
So how about before the April 7th meeting, and then or by that deadline, just to find an arbitrary deadline. You have a special meeting on the 31st, but that seems soon maybe.
So does that sound good? The April 7th? That should be plenty of time.
It'd be fine.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, we'll send that out to the rest of the planning commissioners who maybe didn't make it tonight, to let them know that it was agreed to. And here's the template. We'll add that little, add your district if you're at large, and then send it back out as non-draft. And then you can fill it out and submit it back to, probably back to Polly by the 7th, but we'll put that in the email.
Jennifer, can you explain to me what an at-large person is? I just assume everybody.
Yeah. It's just a term. They don't have to live in the district of the nominating board of county commissioner. So each county commissioner has they have 3 appointments they can nominate. 2 have to live in their district. 1 can live anywhere in Thurston County. Mm-hmm. That's the at-large position.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions about the bio sheets? Thoughts? Comments? Rip it up. Okay, so you all should have had that in your email. If not, please get a hold of Jennifer, or she's going to adjust it and then send out
Yep.
And then you should get all that pretty soon. And our deadline will be the 7th of April. Isn't that right?
April. Okay. Good.
We'll send it all out in email.
Okay, perfect. Great. Thank you, Jennifer, for putting that together.
No problem.
Send it in a Word document so we can actually use it.
For sure.
Good thought. Okay, so we're moving on to our next item, which is a work session with the wireless code. We have Caitlin Nelson and Ken Fellman on this one.
Yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Kate. Kate's one of our associate planners. She's been here before, but some of you haven't met her. She's worked on lots of projects for us, and she works on mostly natural resource issues, but she's the lucky associate planner who was assigned the wireless code update. And she's lucky in a way because we do have Ken Fellman, who's a consultant working with our prosecuting attorney's office on this project as well, and he'll explain all why there's legal components to this, but I'm going to turn it just now over to Kate and Ken to kind of run this next part of the agenda.
Thank you. Good evening. So like Jennifer mentioned, our wireless consultant, Ken Fellman, is joining us and has been working with me and other staff to develop our wireless code draft. And he will be providing a presentation shortly on the background of the wireless code update, especially regarding the ongoing changes in the law that have initiated the need to update the code. Prior to our next Planning Commission meeting, you'll be provided with the draft code and more clarification on where the Planning Commission has the authority to request changes to the draft around these laws. But today we're just focusing on the background. We can take questions at the end of the presentation and we'll attempt to answer, but if we can't answer something, staff will bring answers to the next Planning Commission meeting. Just as a reminder, if you think of any questions after this meeting, please be prepared to share them with the staff during the next Planning Commission and we'll try to answer them then. Okay, go ahead, Ken.
Thank you, Kate. Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, it's nice to be with you this evening. I am going to see if I can share my screen here. And let's see, can you all see that?
I can, yep.
Okay. So we are going to talk first about, let's see, why are we doing this? First of all, the county has began looking at updating all of the chapters of the county code that relate to telecommunications and broadband. That's everything from how you manage facilities in the rights of way to zoning issues to franchise issues. That was back almost 10 years ago now, hard to believe.
Hey, Ken, this is Jennifer. Are we supposed to be seeing a PowerPoint? Because right now we just see the Zoom screen on your screen.
It says you are screen sharing and I'm looking at a PowerPoint. So yeah.
We are not looking at that. So
well,
let's see
if we can fix that. All right, maybe we'll try to that. Yeah, wow, that's weird. Okay, let's
I've had issues sharing PowerPoints in the past.
Yeah, I have not, surprisingly, but boy, there's always, all right, so I'm going to stop the share. All right, now I am back to looking at all of you. If I hit share screen, hold and shift to select more. It's only giving me one option where it says Google Chrome. So let me look at advanced. There we go. Files? No, I mean, I could.
Ken, do you by any chance have two screens?
No.
Okay. If we can't get it to work, I can always pull up the PowerPoint on my screen and try sharing it. And you can tell me when to move on.
Well, yeah, I think there is a way I can get the earlier version of this, but why don't you put yours on? Because I know you made some minor modifications in it, Kate, and then we'll have the most recent one on here. Okay. Now you can see what I was looking at a few minutes ago. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so here's where we were. We've been looking at a variety of updating a variety of chapters to the county code. Some of these have been done. We started with the right-of-way code, and we started looking at the wireless code in 2016. We've had some fits and starts since then, and it's a long, boring story as to how we got here, but this is where we are right now. So we will move on to the next slide. The underlying reasons why we're doing this is because the law has changed, and who knows, maybe the fact that it's taken so long, we've actually saved some time and money because the law has changed multiple times. The biggest change was back in 1996 when the Congress passed the Telecommunications Act, That was the first major update to the Communications Act of 1934. It seemed really up to date at the time, and now that's over 15 years old and out of date. But what that statute did in 1996, it impacted local authority and local control in a variety of different ways, relating to land use authority, relating to rights of way. It's a very long bill. It had a lot of sections that dealt with industry related things that didn't have much to do with local government. But we're going to talk tonight about specifically about how it impacted land use authority. Since the passage of that act, there have been some other bills that Congress have passed further impacting local authority. And then the Federal Communications Commission has had multiple orders and rulemakings over the years to interpret this act and others that have imposed new and even more restrictive conditions on local control. We do still have some authority here. And the reason that we need to update the code is because the code really needs to reflect how we best utilize the local authority that you still do have. And we also, frankly, need to take out those parts of the code where there no longer is any local authority. So I know the code had a pretty comprehensive amendment in 2003 that went a long way towards incorporating a lot of the 96 Act. There were minor amendments 2 other times since, but we are still behind. So next slide. The one particular provision of the 96 law that impacts us is section 704, and that creates a framework for regulating what the law calls personal wireless service. It covers both macro sites on private property, like you see in the image on top, and it also applies to facilities in the public rights of way, which is a small cell site that you see on the bottom. Essentially, the federal statute does preserve local authority, but it creates 5 areas of preemption. So it kind of creates a box in which we have to operate. So move to the next slide, please. Basically, those 5 categories are when you look at the entirety of the county regulations, the regulations cannot unreasonably discriminate between providers of functionally equivalent service. We can't have regulations that prohibit or have the effect of prohibiting the provision of personal wireless service. When you get an application, must be acted upon within a reasonable period of time. The regulations, well, we cannot adopt local regulations that regulate based on the environmental, and that includes the health effects of radio frequency emissions, so long as those emissions comply with the federal regulations that the FCC adopts. And if there is a decision to deny an application for a wireless site, it must be in writing and supported by evidence in a written record. So we'll move on from here. Just going to talk a little bit more about some of those 5 categories, and some more than other. We can't have unreasonable discrimination. Basically, that means you can't have regulations that would favor AT&T at the expense of Verizon. We have to treat everybody relatively the same way, whether it's dealing with aesthetics, visual impact, safety, whatever. But it's interesting that because the law says there can't be unreasonable discrimination, it doesn't mean you have to treat every company exactly the same. Different circumstances allow for some kinds of different requirements. Next slide. The kind of second issue is, in my opinion, really the most important one. The regulations can't prohibit or have the effect of prohibiting a company's ability to provide service. So what does that mean? Outright bans are preempted. You couldn't have a code that said, we will never allow a wireless site in a residential neighborhood under any circumstances. That would be preempted under federal law. But what does it mean to be a regulation that has the effect of prohibiting the provision of service? That phrase has generated a lot of litigation over the years, and we're still not 100% clear. But again, we need to make sure the code reflects our current understanding of the law. You are able to impose conditions that might increase a provider's costs if they're for a valid purpose, like mitigating the negative impacts of a site, as long as it doesn't prohibit the ability to provide service. One example of that is local governments can require an applicant to demonstrate that the site that they have chosen is really the least intrusive site among other options that they might have. So again, the regulations need to be tailored to provide that level of flexibility, but not so much so that a regulation could have the effect of prohibiting service. Next slide. So we have to act within a reasonable period of time. And the FCC had a proceeding that in 2009 where it determined what is a reasonable period of time and what happens if you don't act in a reasonable period of time. What the FCC determined then, you may have heard of this as called the shot clock order, that if there's an application for a new wireless structure, you have 150 days to act upon it. If it's a co-location on an existing structure, you have 90 days to act upon it. If you don't act within that period of time, it doesn't mean that you automatically must grant a building permit. What it means is the applicant may now go to court and say, Judge, they didn't act in a reasonable period of time, make them act or make them grant my permit. And then you end up having a court case. So that was the 2009 declaratory ruling. Next slide. So one of the categories was we can't regulate based on the environmental effects of RF emissions. One of the questions that I get and that my colleagues get almost more than any other question, any place we work around the country, is how far can we go, and is this safe, and can we adopt regulations that guarantee our citizens are going to be safe? The law is very clear. The FCC has the authority to adopt regulations concerning RF emissions, including what's the maximum exposure limits. And frankly, under those FCC rules, most wireless sites are what the law considers categorically exempt, what the FCC rules consider it categorically exempt. So we have very, very limited authority here. You can require a company to demonstrate that it complies with the federal regulations. You cannot create new regulations that are inconsistent or go beyond the federal regulations. I suspect as we start seeing more and more deployment, actually, I don't suspect, I'm seeing this in the places we work, more and more people raising concerns about that. As a planning board, you need to obviously be respectful of those concerns. You also need to understand there's not a whole lot that we can do other than enforce compliance with or force demonstration of compliance with federal regulations. Next slide. Denials must be in writing. This is kind of an easy one. Most jurisdictions, regardless of whether you approve or deny a land use application, it's usually in writing. You usually set forth findings of fact as to what you're finding in the record that supports your decision. But this is one element of that 1996 Act that basically says if you deny an application, it must be in writing. It must be based upon evidence in your record. This is one area that I'm not very concerned about. Whether it's Thurston County or most other places, this is pretty easy to comply with. Next slide. Now we're going to jump beyond the 1996 Act. Fast forward to 2012, Congress passed a statute called the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act. What does that have to do with wireless siting, you might ask? In 2012, we were about to have a bunch of tax credits go out the door because Congress was deadlocked and everybody was going to lose these tax credits if they didn't act by midnight on a certain day. And at the last minute, the Congress passed a new tax relief bill. And one half of that bill had nothing to do with tax relief or job creation. It had everything to do with creating a spectrum that was going to be provided to public safety or for public safety and the creation of a nationwide interoperable public safety communications network. People had a lot of discussions then. It's 10 years after 9/11. We still don't have an interoperable nationwide public safety network. And there was one paragraph in this public safety portion of the tax relief bill that says what you see on the screen here, that local governments may not deny and shall approve. That's pretty strong language, no discretion. Any eligible facilities request for modification of an existing tower or base station, as long as it doesn't substantially change the physical dimensions of the tower or the base station. if you are wondering, what does that mean? You are not the first who have wondered that, but this was one paragraph in a long federal statute, and it led to the next slide, which is basically, we had all of these terms that nobody knew exactly what they meant. In fact, some people thought they knew what they meant. The FCC opened up a proceeding, and in 2014, they issued an order basically interpreting all these terms from that one paragraph that Congress never really told us what they meant. What is an eligible facilities request? What does it mean to substantially change the physical dimensions of a site? And without getting into the weeds on this, they came up with, well, if you go up no more than 20 feet from an approved site. So if you had approved a 100-foot tower and they want to increase it by 18 feet to add another antenna array, doesn't go through land use approval. That's not a substantial change under the FCC rules. The local government must approve that site. I list the other terms only to identify for you how crazy the debate was at the time, because if you ask people, if you ask reasonably intelligent people who do not work in this industry, what is a tower? I think most people would agree what a tower is, but we actually had to have a fight at the FCC to determine whether this is what the industry wanted. Any structure that was capable of housing an antenna should be considered a tower, which would have meant your house and my house would be a tower. That was actually on the table. They didn't come down with that, but that was the kind of debate. What does it mean to be existing? Some argued that if a tower doesn't have structural integrity for these new antennas and they take the whole thing down and build a brand new one in its place, that's an existing structure. Well, no, it's not. You took the old one down and you're building a new one. And the FCC had to come up with a definition for that as well. All of those new federal terms have to be included or should be included in local land use codes so that both planning commissioners and elected officials and staff knows what the federal law requires when you have an application at the local level. Next slide. As bad as it was before the last administration, I will tell you that the last 4 years have just seen an incredible slew of new legislation and regulations dealing with local control over wireless, and particularly the 2018 to 2020 time period. We got hit with a lot of FCC regulations that impact local control. Again, I don't want to get in the weeds on any of these, but just to give you an idea, in March of 18, they came out with an order that exempts certain federal environmental and historic preservation laws when wireless sites are being cited. That was overturned in part on appeal, but there are elements of it that remain. Later that year, they came up with an order that preempted local government moratoria oversight. So if you said, we want to put a 6-month hold on this so we can study our code and figure out what kind of changes to make, can't do that anymore. It's now illegal under federal law. A month later, they came out with a very important order that I'm going to talk more about in a minute, called we call it the small cell order. It created new shot clocks, new time frames in which you have to act on what they call small cell facilities, which really aren't very small, but those are the poles and the antennas that we're going to start seeing in rights of way. Limitations on fees, limitations on your process, issues relating to how you deal with design criteria. All of those were included in the small cell order. They had a proceeding open for literally about 18 years to determine whether they should update their radio frequency emission rules that I mentioned briefly earlier to incorporate any new science and the new technologies that are starting to come out. Local governments pushed the FCC really hard for 5 or 6 years to please finish this new process, to update their rules, to give us tools on the local level that would help deal with these concerns that our citizens have. And at some point it became so strained that people were commenting that this FCC proceeding was now almost old enough to vote. And then they finally made a decision at the end of 2019 and determined they didn't need to change their rules. Pretty much everything was okay. New technologies don't really make a difference. And Now that's being appealed, but we're still dealing with the old rules. And then last year in June, they clarified that 2014 order that I mentioned earlier on when you have to mandatorily approve certain kinds of modifications to sites. And they changed the rules again as to what that meant, which meant that for communities that had changed their codes to come into compliance with the 2014 rules, now those rules mean something else, and we got to change them again. So just a taste of what regulators have been doing with and to us over the last few years. Next slide. So I just want to talk a little bit about this 2018 small cell order, because that gets back to one of the key issues I mentioned earlier. What does it mean to prohibit or effectively prohibit the ability to provide service? And what the FCC said was, if your regulations materially inhibit the ability to provide service, then you're effectively prohibiting service and you're in violation of the statute. So, well, what does that mean? So they created these tests and thresholds to say, if your fees are over a certain amount, we presume that that materially inhibits the ability to provide service. If you impose aesthetic requirements in this way, if you impose these kinds of undergrounding requirements, we presume that you are materially inhibiting. If you take this too much time, and they have these new shot clocks, we presume that you're not acting in a timely manner, that kind of thing. They created cost caps. I know Thurston County doesn't own a lot of its poles, but if you look at a city like Tacoma or Seattle that have municipal utilities and own their light poles, I mean, the federal government has now basically said you can't charge rent for the use of the poles. These companies get to use those poles, and you can charge them $270 per pole per year, no more. So that kind of restriction. And then they redefined what it meant to co-locate. In the 2014 rules, they said co-location means you're adding something onto a site that's been approved and already has antennas on it, right? We're co-locating on an existing site. Under the small cell order, for small cells only, not for macro site, not for big tower sites, but for small cells, if you're putting in a small cell antenna on any structure that is capable of housing it, even if it's never been approved for that before, that's considered a co-location, and it comes under a shorter shot clock. So again, a taste of the kind of things that we now have to address in our code. Next slide. This order was appealed to the federal court in the Ninth Circuit. It was the City of Portland versus FCC. In the court decision, which was issued last August, the court upheld a lot of the FCC order on what it means to materially inhibit and some of these fee limitations, the shot clock, but they overturned the FCC order and vacated the order that restricted local government's ability to impose aesthetic requirements. So if you see in the slide or the picture on your screen, that's the kind of thing I think that most local governments would like to make sure we never see in our community, certainly not in a residential area. And thankfully, because of a partial win in this case, we now have more authority to impose aesthetic guidelines that would eliminate the possibility of something like this. Just as a postscript, I don't know if the Supreme Court will take the case, but the Supreme Court is going to be asked to grant a further appeal on this case. And we'll know more in a couple of months as to whether this appeal is going to continue. But these are the rules that we're dealing with now. Next slide. As an example of what they hit us with last year in June, this quote unquote clarification, we used to think that the terms camouflage and conceal meant about the same thing. That when you approve a site as a planning commission, or you recommend approval and you impose conditions to put it behind the tree line, or to, like the picture on the top it's on a structure where it's painted a certain color and the antennas are below the top part of the structure, so it minimizes the profile. That would be camouflage. And under that mandatory co-location rule I mentioned earlier, one of the elements is And this is why we have to have these things in our code, so we know if the proposed modification would defeat the concealment elements of the site, then you don't have to mandatorily approve it. You can make it go through your regular land use process, determine if it's the right thing to do, and say yes or no. But the new rules that they adopted last June say conceal means it has to look like something else. But camouflage now means it just has to be sort of, not look like something completely different, but blending in, minimizing the profile. If an applicant for that slide on the top wanted to come in and put up 4 new 10-foot antennas on the top of that structure, the fact that it would defeat the camouflage elements that minimize the profile, you would still have to approve it today. The photo on the bottom is a really unique structure in Colorado. It looks like a buffalo sculpture. It's on a hillside right on the northernmost part of the state, just before you get to Wyoming. And what you can only see if you squint and look really closely at that photo is it has 4 antennas on the side of the buffalo structure. So when you're driving along the highway, it really does look like something else. Now, if they wanted to put 4 antennas on the buffalo's back, the government would not have to approve that, because that would defeat the concealment, but it wouldn't defeat it if it was just camouflage. Again, it's a hassle. It's a restriction on local authority that we would like to avoid. And this case is also being challenged in court right now, but it reflects the importance of having a code that makes it clear to the staff what they can do, what they can't do, and when to advise you as to the scope of your authority in dealing with applications to modify these kinds of sites. Next slide. So in developing the code that you're going to see in a few weeks, one of the things that we did early in the process was reach out to the wireless providers in Western Washington. We received feedback from them. Again, this was at the early part of the process. They gave us feedback and we incorporated a lot of their comments into initial drafts. As we have restarted the process over the last year or so, they have not been directly involved, so that when you see this new draft, they're going to see it at the same time. And I fully expect they will have issues that they want to raise with us now that a revised draft is going to start moving forward. And as we have done in the past, we will listen respectfully and see if we can make accommodations where it makes sense to do that. Next slide, please. So you're going to see a number of modifications to the definitions so that local definitions will conform to the federal definitions that we have to deal with, and that will be in 2003 of the code. And then the substantive part of the code, 2033, that's going to address all the bullet points that you see on there to, again, bring us into compliance with the federal regulations as we understand them now, eliminate those regulations that we've had that are inconsistent now with what the law says, and also, again, to the extent that we do have authority as a local government to regulate these facilities and impose aesthetic requirements and other public safety kinds of requirements, it will be an easier tool to allow the county to exercise the authority that it has. So I think we are up to the last slide, which has my contact information and Kate's contact information. I think Kate's preference is, I don't know if we have time for questions now. If we do, we can try to answer them. If you have follow-up questions in writing, I think Kate's preference is that you provide them to her and she will work with me on them and we will get them back to you before the next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Does anybody have a quick question that we might be able to answer right away? Sounds like we're good, Ken.
All right.
Very much for your presentation. This is going to be some good stuff.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot to digest, and we will look forward to working through the process with you. And next step is to finalize this draft and get it off to you before your next meeting. So we're looking forward to that.
I guess I do have one question. Is there some type of a timeline where we want to have this completed as far as our part?
Well, I will defer to Kate and Jennifer on that one.
Kate, do you have something to note about the timeline? I know that this was something that the county's had on the docket for a while. I think it's next up in terms of priorities. So I'm hopeful that it can get through your process in the coming couple of, months of meetings. You have the Shoreline Master Program update going on, and the joint plans will be starting. And then of course this, so it's going to be a lot on your plate, but if we could get this to the board a couple months from now, they'll have a chance for adoption on their end by the end of this year, which would be ideal.
Sure. Yeah, and I agree. It is at the Planning Commission's discretion. The biggest thing with this code is that since we don't have a lot of these items in our code currently, it is difficult because we still have to process them the way that the law says that we do, even though we don't have the code to back it up. So it does create a little bit of a hassle not having that code in place. So that's the main timeline concern.
Yeah, we're implementing these applications right now per the federal requirements and doing the best we can with that without having the code in place. It is challenging. So I would agree that sooner is better.
Perfect. Okay, good to know.
So will there be a draft the next time we look at it?
Yes.
Okay.
And I'm sure
Thanks,
that will
guys.
generate, a lot more substantive questions, both from you and from the
Absolutely.
industry and perhaps the public too. So we'll be prepared at the next meeting to answer a lot of questions.
Yeah, okay, good. I was just kind of thinking, when does the industry get it? They will see the draft the same time that we do?
I think that's what the plan is now, Kate. Is that right?
Yeah, this most updated draft, they, like Ken mentioned, they did receive an earlier draft, and we have incorporated a lot of their comments, but have also made other changes since then. We will be sending it to them about the same time that we send it to Planning Commission, yes.
Is it, and I guess my question is it a good relationship with the industry, or are they going to come in and start screaming at us?
I'd say that it's been a pretty good relationship. Yeah, I think that there's definitely room for open discussion.
Yeah.
Say screaming.
Mr. Chairman, I would tell you, I have done this for multiple jurisdictions in multiple states. The most recent major overhaul I did in Washington was actually in Tumwater. We're not going to agree with everything that they say. We have a good working relationship. I think there's a significant amount of mutual respect. They understand the challenges that the county has to try to get this in place. And frankly, it's really important to the citizens that they understand that, they have a chance to come in and comment on this too. And I have seen, because these things can get out of control depending upon the local community, but I've seen the mere fact of a respectful working relationship with the industry turn into allegations of not caring about what the citizens want and being in bed with the industry. And I don't expect that we're going to see that here. But what I would say to you is we have tried to maintain open lines of communication and a respectful relationship with everyone that's going to have an interest in what this new code looks like.
Great. Any other questions, comments? Okay, so thank you too. We look forward to visiting with you soon, and we're moving on.
All right, thank you. I'm going to sign off. Enjoy the rest of your meeting.
All right, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're off to Andrew, back to our Shoreline.
Good evening, Chair and Planning Commission, Andrew DeFovas, Community Planning. So we'll continue tonight with our review of the draft Shoreline Master Program. We're looking at specific amendments that the Planning Commission wishes to make for the next draft, which will be a draft prepared for your public hearing. We did receive 2 written comments since the last meeting, and we had a little email snafu. So those were sent out to you within the last hour. So you now have them, and they are now posted online. just an FYI. I also wanted to give you an update on an issue you've heard about in the recent past regarding the shoreline environment designations for Lake Lawrence. As you'll recall, the Planning Commission in past meetings has made some revisions to some of the shoreline environment designations, including most recently reached LLA 8, which is otherwise known as Goat Island. So in their comments to the county and their analysis of the issue, the citizens that wrote in noted that that portion of the Lake Lawrence shoreline was not currently designated under the SMP, and also that a chunk of the shoreline on the mainland was also not designated in the SMP. So when I did my analysis using the SMP layer, the current SMP layer that is in geodata reflecting the 1990 document, those areas did show up, and the reach in question, the Lake Lawrence 8, showed up, at least a portion of it, as natural. It wasn't quite matching the configurations that you see on the map, but it did show up. So I wanted to run that to ground, and I had questions from the citizens that are involved to run that to ground and see what the discrepancy was. So after some digging and working with geodata, it turns out that that portion of the data for that Goat Island area and the adjacent mainland shoreline, it appears it was removed from the data layer in 2004 by an employee that was employed at the county at that time. This was not processed as a formal SMP amendment. I do not know the motivations or rationale behind that removal, but essentially it was taken out. And it should not have been taken out. So when the consultants did their work in 2013 and were looking at doing an inventory and characterization of the shoreline, they would have used that amended layer and saw that, yeah, this is not in SMP jurisdiction. And so in the reports that are appendices to this program, it doesn't show as being currently in. And also the map that was on our website reflecting the 1990 jurisdiction was created in 2013. So it also erroneously showed those areas not being in SMP jurisdiction. So that issue was caught and fixed in 2016, and those areas were added back to the data layer, which is what I used for preparing for your review. So hence when I came and said, this area is designated currently as natural, that did not match what was available on our website. So I have now gone back and I've worked with our GIS folks, and we have amended the map that is available to the public. So when people go and look, they can see the best and the greatest data that we have as to what is currently subject to the SMP. And this does appear to be a unique situation. It is not indicative of a fundamental flaw in the data. It is the only example of this sort of issue that we are aware of. But you've been hearing about it at multiple meetings, so I wanted to bring that back to you and make sure to follow up on that. The other clarification I wanted to ask about was last time we talked about mining in the SMP, and there were questions about whether there are any gravel mine lakes that are currently operational as gravel mines that are also designated in the draft SMP. And the intent in the county's SMP is to not assign a shoreline environment designation to any active gravel mines, because they are not natural. The lakes they create are not natural, and they may not even stick around after that mining operation concludes. They may be, filled back in. So it's also tricky because apparently there's not a very succinct way that these active versus non-active operations have been tracked in our permit system or on geodata. So I wanted to circle back with the Planning Commission. This was raised by a couple of folks last time, and to see if you are aware of any specific water bodies that I should be looking at to see if we've got this correct. And I can go and run that to ground. I'm still doing some digging on it, but for those planning commissioners who spoke about this last time, if you have any additional information that would help that, you can let me know, and I'd be happy to take a look at that. But like I said, the intent is that if it's active, it is not going to be a shoreline.
I'll send you an email then, Andy.
Okay, that sounds great. Yeah, we want to, and I will also, one thing to clarify there is differences between a lake that, we're talking about gravel mine lakes that are created by mining versus some other shoreline water body that potentially has a mining operation in it, but wasn't created by that operation. So there is that distinction. But yes, please email me and like I said, I'll run that to ground because in 2013, the inventory and characterization looked at this issue and it noted where there was mining, but that's a snapshot. So we definitely want to take a look and see if there is anything newer that we need to be aware of. Okay, and with that, I will go ahead and launch, share my screen and launch the draft, and we can keep working through chapter 19,600. All right, you should be looking at the draft, and we should be at, we are in the chapter 19,600 in the development standards for moorage structures. And I think we're in the general standards. Yes, development standards for mooring structures, and we are on letter P. So I will open it up and see if anyone has comments starting with this section and moving forward.
Andrew, I just wanted to revisit O real quick. In rereading it, I couldn't remember what we decided, but it just seemed like, would this apply to somebody's individual boat dock on a lake?
I think it would. Yeah, and so the note that I have here is to remove the word structures. So, and the intent behind that conversation last time was to allow the dock itself to be pressure washed as maintenance activity, not necessarily to allow equipment to be, pulled out there and pressure washed, et cetera. That's the conversation I remember. That's what I noted here on the draft.
Okay, I wanted to, that's what I remember.
Yep.
Now that you say it too, but I was confused when I reread it.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll keep moving forward here.
On P,
mm-hmm.
The use of transparent roofing material.
Mm-hmm.
I question the thought process in that. I understand that they're concerned about shadows and whatnot, but if you've got a boat sitting on a lift, whether the roofing material is transparent or not, it makes no difference whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the type of structure you're talking about, this saying a transparent roof is like a waste of words.
And I think that was also raised by a citizen a couple meetings ago. So the point being that, the boat is in the lift in the high 90 percentile of time. So, and yeah, you're right. I mean, the intent there is, as with all of these standards, or a lot of these standards, is to try to reduce the impact of the activity. But, we want to be sensical as well. So that, could be something to remove or flag for removal. So I would defer to the Planning Commission if that's something you want me to do.
I think the benefit of a transparent roof is nominal compared to the effects of having to construct transparent roofs. I think that the cost is huge, the benefit is minute, and so to remove P would be my preference.
Mm-hmm. So that brings back another issue that was raised at this meeting. So, because there's a couple different things going on there. The first is a prohibition on new covered moorage. And then the second is development standards for existing covered moorage.
Right.
So I just wanted to make that clear that there's two pieces there.
But I think they go hand in hand in the sense that why prohibit covered storage if a boat's going to be sitting on a lift? Now I can understand boathouses,
mm-hmm.
Which is a little different, although it serves the same purpose. But boat lifts are different.
Mm-hmm. And it may be there may be a need to parse that out here, and that would definitely be something that I would also want to run to ground, because I was trying to, when this came up in the comments, I went to the state law and tried to quickly find what I thought I might be looking for and couldn't find it. I know that there are prohibitions on new overwater structures in the state law, but I'm not sure exactly how far they go. So this could be an area to flag and come back with some options potentially. But what I heard from you, Commissioner Carmen, was to maybe differentiate between boathouses versus, you have a lift and you put like a canvas, whatever, the roofing material that goes over them.
Cover over it. So
Yeah.
I'd suggest you separate this out and look at it. And I know that back in 2011, the legislature clarified overwater structures and they defined it as a houseboat.
Mm-hmm. Right. Those are, new overwater residences, including floating homes, houseboats, to my knowledge, those are prohibited. Okay. And yeah, I don't think there is an outright prohibition on this stuff, but yeah, I'd like to take a look at that. The reason I say that is because it kind of ties into the comment there that I have listed for public hearing, which came back from my conversations with ecology. So, Sarah Castle read this and said, okay, well, you're prohibiting it for residential moorage. What about commercial or industrial? Because there are other counties that have found justification for allowing that. So this just might need another look. But what I'm getting from the Planning Commission is to, so I mean, yeah, a little instruction on what would you want to limit covered moorage to? If we want to, which types should be potentially allowed and which types should potentially be disallowed? If I have guidance from you there, I can do some digging on that.
Well, I think boat lifts with a cover on it should be fine. When you think about marine environment, they make huge docks that have lifts for boats, and the whole strip is covered. It's like a parking garage. I don't have a feel for that.
Mm-hmm.
But because all of them are not going to be, well, maybe in Seattle they would be, but down here they might not all be full.
Mm-hmm.
But at least separate them out so that there could be comment from the public.
Okay.
Anybody else have comments?
I think if this was broken out by SED, it wouldn't hurt either. If we left a prohibition in natural or or conservancy, that's one thing, but having a prohibition in shoreline residential or urban conservancy doesn't seem appropriate to me.
If it's a solitary boat lift, what difference does it make what kind of roof it has?
So the intent there is to minimize the impacts of shading the water. So a transparent roof would allow more light to reach the water column. So potentially has a smaller impact on aquatic vegetation or shading for fish. But the point here, is that if it's an area where a boat is usually parked, the benefit may be minimal because it's going to be parked most of the time. You're not on the boat the vast majority of the time. It's parked most of the time.
Right. If the boat is in the lift, the light can't get through the boat either.
Exactly. So that was the thought, and that makes sense. But then, so that's the second half of that clause there, or that letter P. But the first piece is it currently is a prohibition on any new covered moorage, and that's in saying, someone said let's strike that whole piece, but that bears some thought.
Andy, since it was my suggestion to strike P, maybe if we modified that and just strike the second half about covered or about transparency, and in the first half, if we could break that out by SED in the more protected areas, have a prohibition against covered moorage, but in the more developed areas, not have a prohibition against covered moorage.
Mm-hmm.
Does that sound half reasonable?
I can work with that. Is that something, looking at your seatmates, is that something folks would like me to take a look at? Let's see here.
Well, I don't know about the entire roof, but I believe that DNR has some requirements about transparent roofing on moorages or on marinas or whatever as a fire issue.
Yeah, and anything we do, that requires multiple permits, I mean, they're going to have to make sure their project is in line with any requirements, not just ours. So that's definitely a good thought. Okay, and so what I'm hearing is, strike the second piece and work up some more options on the others. Is that an approach that folks want me to take forward?
Yes.
If what Scott is saying is true, that it's something that DNR is requiring, I mean, it seems like we need to, why would we go against them? Maybe we can find out if the DNR part.
Yeah. Okay. Well, why don't I then, okay, what I will do, like similar to some of the other issues we mark up, is to just strike it unless there is some prevailing state law or some reason to not do so. And in this instance, it's coming from outside of SMA land. It may be coming from somewhere else where, you know, we don't want to purposely steer people wrong into thinking that they could do something when we know that another agency that potentially weighs in on this would say otherwise. So I'll just take that down to research whether other agencies such as DNR require transparent materials, strike. Okay.
And Andy, DNR requirements, I believe, just are, and they have mooring, anchor requirements and things, but it's for state-owned aquatic lands. But it could be interesting to see what their permit requirements are and if they had any around these other types of facilities on state-owned aquatic lands and why, and if there's science behind that or something that we're not aware of.
Yeah. And let me, okay, let me add that here. DNR rules. That makes sense to me because I was trying to think, you know, does DNR get involved with covered moorage or docks? And I wasn't aware that they do, but it makes sense that they would on aquatic lands. Okay.
And Andy, I don't mean to confuse us even more, but even on those areas where we might consider a prohibition, like in the natural area or something like that, I think that we should probably allow some sort of provision where, say somebody was allowed to build a dock and they gave up some of that dock for covered moorage, the effects would still be the same of how much surface area was being covered. So if there's some way that we can incorporate that, you can have a shorter dock if you want covered moorage or something in the natural.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that would be inappropriate either.
As long as the square footage would be the same, is that what you said?
Yeah, as long that it still had the same square footage of covering over the surface waters.
Yeah,
because they don't really care whether it's a dock or it's covered moorage that's blocking sunlight. It's blocking sunlight that's the issue, not what's blocking the sunlight.
Yeah, that may be tricky because, well, not impossible, but it may be tricky just because I went back and looked through this section before the meeting because there was a conversation last time about whether there are any dimensional standards for docks in here, and there really aren't. So people are proposing what they need for the intended use, and they are demonstrating that it is the minimum necessary. That's how this is currently written. And so I'm not sure how you would do, I mean, I guess, you know, you're basically saying I need a dock that's 40 feet long, but I'm willing to do 30 feet if I'm able to do, but I can make it work with 30 if I did a covered or a lift or something like that. I'm not exactly sure how that would work.
Okay, well, I mean, if you come up with a great idea, we certainly consider it, but I don't have super strong feelings on it either.
Right. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I can work on that. And yeah, like I said, go back and look at state law and see if there is any specific guidance on this. I don't know that there really is, other than just the general stuff about limiting modifications and minimizing impacts and all those good things. I think that's where this prohibition stemmed from. Okay. So I will move on. Anything else on this page, or I'll
on
keep
R, and just a general discussion on grading. When we get further into the document on docks and specific and the spacing of the piers have significant impact on the size of the beam that's needed to span. And I did some calculations on 20-foot span, and in some cases you have a space that a beam or an opening that could have grading on it with no cross pieces of 12 inches wide by 13 inches deep. So In other words, any shading, there would be no shading whatsoever because the beam is so deep and they're so close together that the sun has to be directly overhead in order to have any impact. So I don't know how you take that into account here, but you could have 50% open space, but it absolutely does zero shading.
And I think the draft, I believe it contemplates smaller widths between pilings, and that hopefully will help with that issue. But I did note, I think it was for critical saltwater habitat, that there's even a wider span between pilings. And I thought of you because you brought this up the last time. So when we get down to there, we may look at that. So.
Yeah, I only bring that up now because they're using all this 50%, 40%, 60%.
Mm-hmm.
I hate wasting, thinking we're doing good and we're not.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's totally appropriate to call those things out now. I mean, it's supposed to be effective, and if it's not, what are we doing? So, okay.
In that same section of R, when it opens with in marine waters and salmon bearing lakes, do we have a list of which lakes are salmon bearing, or who makes that determination?
I am working on that issue because that has been raised by citizens as well. And so if this language survives, if it gets all the way through Planning Commission and the board and ecology, we are going to need to make that list for our planners so they know where to implement the regulations, and so the public knows what to expect depending on where they live. So I'm working on that. I don't want to say anecdotal, but my unofficial knowledge is that there are only 2 salmon-bearing lakes in the county. However, if you look at, say, our geodata layers, there are, and turn on all the layers related to protected species or priority species, salmon information pops up on more than 2 lakes. So how do we figure that out? And, how are they going to actually know? And is it something that we can do when in changing that data, when that data comes from an outside agency, versus is it an administrative policy we're going to need to adopt? All those things are in play. And I think it's most appropriate to handle it one of those 2 ways, either with the data or with an administrative policy versus trying to bake something into the draft, because those conditions could change and we don't want to be locked in. So excellent point, and absolutely is something that's on my radar, because if we're making the point here to differentiate between these different types of lakes, then we need to have a list to point to. So.
And you can't depend on the Department of Fish and Wildlife for the answer to that question.
Well, they're certainly helping to inform the question, but all of that
lakes that they say categorized as salmon-bearing lakes, but haven't had salmon in them for over 100 years, and there's no way a salmon could get to them.
Right. Well, that's what I'm trying to put together or work on, is a updated list.
But you were saying that the term salmon-bearing lake and what qualifies as a salmon-bearing lake for this draft will be at our discretion, at the county's discretion. It's not going to be something that ecology hands to us or DNR hands to us.
I mean, I don't think so. We are going to take the best data that we can, and it may come from those agencies, right? But ultimately, the county is going to, figure out what applies and where. I would say, if it's a lake that supports a listed species, whether we cover it or not, it's going to be protected because it's a listed species. I'm thinking like Puget Sound, Salmon Run. But yeah, we would be setting the universe of where these rules applies based on the data that we are using, and it's got to be the best available science or the best professional judgment. We have to vet it, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's an update that I'm working on, because like I said, we have these data layers, but we have other knowledge that says these aren't exactly right. And much like with our wetland data, where it's mapped as a wetland perhaps, but on the ground it's dry. Well, okay, then you determine that in the field. But if we are able to at the outset have an updated list of where we think these rules should apply versus not apply, then we need to do that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and consider that comment, applying anywhere you see this, because this whole piece about marine waters and salmon-bearing lakes, that phrase has been put in multiple places in the document. Okay. So scrolling down, yeah, critical saltwater habitats is the next section. I'll keep going.
How much of C is mandatory?
The newer expanded mooring structure, this piece right here.
Yes. I'm thinking, it's the horizontal distance equal to the maximum distance shade will cast. And, you have to,
yeah,
the sun moves. It's like, and in marine waters, I know very few piers that are not pretty high in the air because of the tides.
Mm-hmm.
It's only the floats that go up and down and are.
Yeah, I would need to look at that because again, in this instance, it's going to come from potentially a couple sections. So there's WACs that have to do with mooring structures, and then there are separate standards that we have to implement program wide for critical saltwater habitat. So off the top of my head, I can't tell you that is rooted in a specific requirement. It may just be an interpretation of attempting to protect these areas, because this is specifically going to apply with critical saltwater habitat, not necessarily everywhere, and this is specifically not going to apply in anything freshwater. So without looking, I do not know.
Andy, when we are looking at things as through the critical saltwater habitat standards lens, does that lens focus enough on eelgrass to make a differentiation between native eelgrasses and invasive versions of eelgrass?
That is still on my list of questions to answer. I'm not sure.
Okay.
But I'm going to run that to ground for you because I know I've heard it kind of both ways. I've heard, yeah, I mean, obviously it's the non-native species there. It's not native. And so there's concern about that, but also is it performing functions that are similar to native vegetation? Maybe some. So I've heard it both ways. I will try to clarify that sooner rather than later. Mm-hmm. Writing it down just again so I don't forget. Okay. All right, moving on. So I'll move down into pilings. This is where potentially we want to spend some time here. Pilings and piers, goes back to some earlier discussions we had. So anything here?
I think you need to be under consideration for 8 feet instead of 10 feet.
Mm-hmm. That can be changed. I mean, this was, yeah, I mean, I think the 10 feet came out of just previous planning commission discussion. So if from a real world user standpoint, folks who are more familiar with what is typical, potentially that's something to put here. Because again, I don't think that the 20 feet has a root in a specific requirement.
Well,
I think we'd benefit from 8 feet.
Sorry, Eric, go ahead.
I think we'd benefit from having that number at a minimum of 8 feet instead of 10 feet, just from a dock construction standpoint, being able to use smaller materials. We would be more protective of the environment by using smaller materials, and we can achieve that by having an 8-foot minimum instead of a 10-foot minimum.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
However, when you get to the marine environment, and if you have a multiple marina type setup, that's where they would use the larger timbers, and you're serving the public, so it's a little different than an individual's dock.
Mm-hmm.
So this could be a case where you might, I really think that piers should be separated between the marine environment and the lake environment, because they're so different in the needs.
So this is, yeah, okay. And so perhaps there's a need to make that differentiation here in 3B.
Well,
You
your
know,
public option limits it to in lakes.
right, and that reflects the previous,
Yeah.
at the time, the previous planning commission conversation.
Okay.
But now, you know, if the planning commission would like to change that to 8 feet, I'm happy to make that change, because it's again, this is just something we are asking the public to weigh in on and draw focus to. Okay, so I can do that. All right, give me a second here. Oh, it won't let me make a comment in a box for some reason, so I'm just gonna write it right above it. Okay. And from what I was hearing from you, Doug, that whole sentence there about considering a shorter distance, what I'm hearing from you is that that may be most appropriate for residential versus something that's commercial or serving a larger public group.
Correct.
Okay, that's a good note, then I will put that on there. Commercial. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Okay. Moving on from 3B. And okay, trying to. All right.
4C, I'm sorry. I made a note here. It said marine only. That's the north-south orientation thing. You know, I think unless that's state law, I think trying to, I mean, people want to put it perpendicular to their property. Now, this might apply to a marina. I mean, you could do, you know, again, a commercial operation versus a residential. But number one, being forced to go as near north-south as possible. And then for every degree, what is it? For every 10 degrees difference, you got to raise it up 2/3 of a foot. You know, again, the sun moves. You don't want to have to walk down to your dock and then walk up 10 feet to get onto the dock.
Yeah, and again, I think that's a lighting consideration, but I don't believe, well, I don't know. I don't want to say, never say never, but I have not seen that specific language when I have been reading the WACs. So going back and looking at the handbook for overwater structures and the WACs might be instructive there. But what I'm hearing from you, so you would prefer to what is your proposal?
I prefer to drop C completely unless it's required. I don't see any real benefit out of it, and it doesn't really help.
Okay. How do the rest of, wait, hold on, before you answer that question, let me change it so I can see more faces. How would the rest of folks feel about that?
I'm with Doug.
I'd like to know more why it's north and south. I guess I'm just not being able to compute what concern is there.
I think it has to do with providing the most light, thinking about the way that the sun moves across the sky, and how much is in shadow, or how much of that is the shadow in one place most of the time versus does the shadow move and afford more light, you know, throughout the day.
Since
that's where
most of our shorelines, our marine shorelines, are on, you know, Johnson Point, Cooper Point, you know, there are these big fingers that run north. That means that most of our shorelines run north-south, and the docks would be perpendicular to those shorelines. So most of our docks going straight off of the shoreline would be east-west, not north-south. Now, all of a sudden, with this requirement, everybody's dock's going to be, it's going to be a boardwalk. It's not going to be a dock.
Mhm. Yeah. So this is essentially saying, do it to the best of your ability. If you can't, you got to raise it up to the point where it becomes an aesthetic conflict, which is not defined and is discretionary.
I would think that a dock that is not perpendicular to the shoreline would be an aesthetic conflict.
Mhm.
And if you had to run it east-west because your shoreline, like Johnson Point, is going north-south, at 90 degrees, you're talking having to raise the dock up 6.75, 6¾ feet.
Mhm.
And, 6¾ feet could very well be a bridge instead of, going up in the air versus straight out or out and down.
I think this is a perfect example of language that, when tailored to the local community, does not fit well.
Yeah, I am happy to take that out. I have pushed a boat cart loaded full of things up a hill, and that's not fun. So
I agree. When I'm thinking of the marinas downtown, it seems like they're all east. They're facing east or west.
Mhm.
Swantown, it heads out towards them. I don't know. It just doesn't seem to make sense.
Okay, well, I will take that out. Again, pursuant to any specific reason in state law to leave that in there, which I don't think there is one, but yeah, pending that review, I will mark it for deletion. Okay, and saved. All right, moving on from 4C.
Under F, you got the 4-foot and 6-foot thing again, where we already talked about having the option for 6 and 8.
Right. So that might just be, oh, hang on, let me scroll back up. Well, okay. Then why don't I just mark that to add that down there as well?
Yeah.
Just for marking purposes. Okay. Okay, great. Good catch. Okay, so moving down, I did make just a note here on the margin for all these figures. They're subject to change. Could be changes may be needed based on any revisions that the Planning Commission makes, that the board makes. So just noting that. So not everything is gonna be fixed right away, but the pile spacing 20 feet minimum under here. So these will be a work in progress as the powers that be work on the draft.
Yeah, okay, the specific comments, though, we talked about a lot of them, but the 8-foot by 15-foot maximum on lakes. I mean, most boats now are 23 feet long, longer than I like them, but nevertheless, that's what they are. So your float on a dock on a lake needs to be longer than 15 feet. As well as a recreational float with 8 by 8 is on the small side. 10 by 10 would be more like what someone might want for a swimming float. 8 by 8, you're going to flip the darn thing over, getting onto it.
I'm not sure, are those standards? Okay, they are further down, I think. Okay, great. Because yeah, I was gonna say it's in the picture and that's great, but the best place to be noting any potential changes to that would be in the standards.
Yeah.
So, okay, so anyway, knowing that the figures are ultimately going to reflect whatever the standards are, we can kind of move past those and into the actual float language, which is number 5 here. And so, yeah, this is where this, so Doug, 5E is where we're at there. So this section has been updated to reflect the whole salmon versus non-salmon bearing lake piece. But yeah, if anyone wants to propose any changes to standards, this would be the place to do it.
Yeah, and that's where under E, I said, 15 feet isn't long enough. And you had said earlier that the overall length is a function of what's needed, right?
Currently as written, yeah, I don't see that. We don't have prescriptive lengths on like the docks and piers and things like that.
Well, the people at Lake Lawrence had complained because they weren't allowed to put a long enough dock out in order to get to deep enough water to put a boat, to have a boat tied to the dock with a motor on it.
Yeah, and I'm still working, running that issue to ground because of the last time. So because yes, there are no standards in here currently that have length on them, but that was something we discussed at the last planning commission meeting was, is it going to be feasible to build a dock in shallow water that is long enough to put a boat out so that it can have the appropriate draft, right?
Right.
And yeah, so I'm still working on that. And again, that might be an issue of not necessarily something that the SMP would prohibit, but what do other agencies that have a say in this, what are they going to say? So, and I'm not familiar with that, or if I have been educated on it before, I'm not recalling the specifics in the Lake Lawrence case. And it sounds like that would be under the current SMP, and there was some reason to not allow that, but I'm not 100% sure.
You wouldn't have known about it, Andrew. It was actually a permitting issue and complaints to the Board of County Commissioners, so it wasn't part of the SMP.
Right. Okay.
But I know about it, so that's why I brought it up.
Right. Okay. So again, I don't know that there are any prescriptions in law for the specific dimensions of these things. So, if you want to propose something else, we can propose it. We can see where it stands. When this public hearing draft is completed and goes out there for review, the technical agencies are going to receive notification of that and have an opportunity to comment. So if there is any flaws in the approach or the proposal, we will certainly hear about it.
Yeah.
So I heard, and it looks like, so essentially striking this 15 feet for lakes would fix that issue for you, correct? Just
right.
Taking that out. All right. So I see Eric nodding. How do the rest of folks feel on that? Essentially, okay. Great. So just essentially making it the same regardless of the water body. So I will make a note. To strike.
And then under E, where 50%, the grading, 50% of the surface on a float. A float needs floats in order to float, right?
Yep.
A float is typically, you can get them in different sizes, but a normal one is like 4 by 4, and you put a whole ton of them under there to make the thing float. Not a lot of, the floats that I've seen, there is not a lot of space where grading would make any impact whatsoever.
Yeah, floats are solid. Floats are solid. So putting grates above something solid doesn't do anything.
Yeah. And again, I don't know if that comes from something that other agencies are going to require, but I can look into it because that.
But what the things that I've read is that and one thing Sarah said back in the beginning is that if you have a rationale that makes sense, they'll approve it. She said, but it's not in front of her yet to approve, but still. She said, if you have a real rationale for why you need to do something that's different for yours, in this case, it shouldn't be different, but It's just not practical. It's not going to happen. You could put grading on it, but it's a waste of money.
Right. Let's see. I'll just put the float material itself would be essentially opaque. It would obscure the light.
Right.
Okay. Okay. Well, yeah, I can look at that and take that out if there's no good reason to have that in there. That on its face seems logical to me. So, okay. And I'll mark it in this one too.
Yeah, that applies in F2, so
Yep.
you did it already. Okay. Sorry, I'm reading and you're typing.
Oh, that's all right. And there's probably a lag as well. So, okay. Anything else in section 5 floats? I'm seeing that same issue in G and H essentially as well.
Right.
Okay. Okay. I'm just going to mark that up here then. Okay, there we go. All right, if nothing else there, we'll move on to number 6, which is the boat launching ramps, railways, and lifts.
In the last draft, you'd said you were going to work with ecology on this section. Did you get any further input from them? There's no changes in it, so.
We had a back and forth about it, but I'm not sure anything ever came of that. I think they were trying to understand what we were proposing and what it meant. But no, I don't know that we got any specific requests to change that. I will go back and look at that though, because you're right, I do remember that. So I can try to draw attention to that and maybe reframe the question or just make sure there wasn't something that they had suggested that I missed.
Yeah. Okay, under A there, it says the private boat launch shall not extend below the ordinary high water unless they are, and I suppose that II gives them the out, will result in no net loss of shoreline ecological function. But, you know, if it's a private boat launch, you don't want the trailers running in over fish beds and whatever's there. So I'm not sure, I'm not sure I understand why it wouldn't be allowed below the high water mark. You can do that in public boat launches.
Right.
Can't pour concrete, but you can put in those concrete beams. I don't know what they call them, like they are using now.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about that because that could be.
Can you explain to me what an elevated private boat launch is? What does it mean when, unless they are elevated above the water line, or what's that mean?
I think it means not that are not a slab, right? Some sort of system that keeps things up off the substrate to the extent feasible. Obviously, it's going to have to touch the ground somewhere at some point. And I wonder if this is, as a broad statement, also wraps in the concept of like a marine rail system.
Yeah, I think it's a rail system is what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Eric, Tim Whipple has one of those.
Yeah, I understand what a marine rail system is. I guess since there is a differentiation between private boat launches, especially when it says in C that marine rail systems are preferred over private boat launches, these in A, the 1, 2, and 3 don't really apply. Those apply specifically to private boat launches and not to marine rail. But still, I guess I'm just really confused about what exactly that is.
I think, and reading this, if the preference is going to be for marine rail systems and applicants are going to have to demonstrate that that is infeasible, potentially that should be the first thing they read. And then the other stuff trickles out below that. If you if you can't do it and you need to do a launch, then that's where those other standards come in. That might make it a little more clear.
Yeah, change elevated to rail system. Is that what you mean?
I was thinking take C and move it up to the top, because that's kind of, you don't get to a private boat launch unless you are able to demonstrate that, well, hang on a sec. So, okay, so boat launch, I mean, as a term could include more than one means of launching a boat, right? So that's not talking about ramps or rail or anything. That's just saying.
Specifically says ramps, private boat launch ramps.
Are A and C contradictory, Andrew?
I don't think so. So A is strictly saying private boat launches. So that would include anything you use to launch a boat, right? And then it starts talking about more specific ones. So it doesn't mention ramps or rail by name in letter A, and that might be by design.
Did you copy this out of the ecology handbook?
No, this did not come from the handbook, I don't believe. But I think that's something I should look at for letter A, and the ordinary high water mark. That's one question, right? That needs to be clarified because it doesn't necessarily make sense the way it's written. But I think clearing that issue up, then this is intended to, that letter A is intended to apply to all methods of launching a boat, and then you get into the specifics of what would be allowed or what would be preferred, and then what the standards would be. So thoughts, anything? So aside from you going back and looking at letter A and the ordinary high piece, what else do you?
Also, if I'm understanding this right, to the rail systems, they only want in the marine areas. They're not really expecting rail systems in freshwater. So there's still, when you're talking about A and B, that still applies to lakes and rivers and streams. But then when we get to C, they're kind of narrowing it down just to marine, unless I'm missing or not understanding this right.
And I'm not sure, without going and looking, because sometimes you see the word marine technically and regulatorily here applies in saltwater, but sometimes you see the word marine tossed around with anything wet and aquatic as well. You see it both ways. So I'm not sure, is that an industry term that it's called marine rail no matter where you deploy it? Is there lake rail? You guys tell me.
We do have some, like I know on Long Lake, there are some rails that people launch with, but they're, I don't think anybody's put in a rail on our freshwater lake in half a century or more.
Yeah, I'm not, just because in this instance, just because it says the word marine, I'm not sure that it's strictly supposed to only apply to marine water. Unless it says otherwise.
I think we should consider marine meaning salt water and keep consistent throughout. I don't want to jump back and forth.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
6 in general is got enough questions on it that maybe Andy running the whole thing through before we make a whole lot of decisions on it would be a good idea.
Yeah, I can do that. So for some clarification, do you see, or are you looking at potentially a need for differentiation between the environment types and what we allow here?
I don't know if I care.
Okay.
I don't know that I care. It seems like it's already doing that.
Yeah.
Because A and B seems to be lakes, and C, D, E is marine. F, I'm not sure what that means. I mean, why, if you got a boat that's floating, why does it have to be 9 feet waterward of the, my boat is 3 feet waterward.
Yeah, especially since why they would take that measurement instead of, it's not like all shorelands drop at the same rate.
Right.
9 feet from ordinary high water could be totally different depths of water.
Yep.
And I don't know that we need to regulate that anyway, because people want their boat to go up on the shore, to bottom out anyway.
Yeah, it is oddly specific, but I do think that was the intent there, to prevent grounding out in the substrate. but there may be other ways to accomplish that, or that may not be the right approach. So yes, I will look into this. I want to kind of look into the marine rail concept and see, kind of where does that, is it literally something that, is this intended to only be in the marine water, or is marine rail an industry term that, you apply it on a lake as well? So I will look at that.
I think there's somewhere else that it says in saltwater, marine environment, you
Right.
have to maintain 3 feet under your boat at low tide. There's someplace else here, whether we haven't gotten to it yet or something. So that's the important thing, because you don't want the boat bottoming out. And then Jim, based on the time, I'd say this is a good spot to stop.
Well, if I might, well, I don't know how much comments people have in number 7, but if we finish 7 and 8, we're done with mooring structures, at least around.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of going for. Hopefully we can get through that.
Yep. I only have one comment in the whole section.
Okay.
Great. And that's on number 8, take the word lakes out. Everything that they talk about in there is rivers and streams.
Yeah. River. Unless, well, unless you have a stream coming into a lake, right? A shoreline stream coming into the lake. I'll look at it. I will look at that.
Andy, I don't mean to back you up here, but marine rail system is defined in chapter 19, 150, 545. And it says a pair of sloping tracks which extends into the tidelands used for the purpose of placing watercraft in and out of the water. There aren't tidelands in freshwater.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then I will look more at that section, because if rail systems are preferred in the marine, what's the sequence then in lakes, or how do we want to address that or approach that? So, okay, I will look at that. All right, and I'll make a comment here to consider removing lakes and look at that more. Does anyone else have anything else at this moment on this section? Otherwise, we will conclude.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks.
Jennifer, any staff updates?
Yeah, a couple quick updates. These are on the dockets. So yesterday, the board adopted 3 amendments to the special use chapter of the zoning code following the Planning Commission's recommendations on resorts and retreats, commercial smokehouses, and childcare facilities. So those projects are complete and adopted. Currently, and you heard some public testimony about this or comment about this at the beginning of the meeting, the board, and I briefed you on this, I think, last meeting, the board is considering adding a couple new proposals to the dockets, and we have an open public written comment period that's through Friday at 5 p.m. this Friday. And those 2 proposals are it's called the Beaver Creek Land Use Amendment, and there is a proposal to make the emergency housing ordinance interim rules permanent. So if folks are interested to provide public comment, go to thurstonplanning.org, go under amendments and updates, and click on comp plan docket, and you can find all the information about how to submit your written comment. That's it.
Yeah. So on to calendars. Our next meeting is March 31st. Will y'all be able to make that? And April 7th would be the following one after that. And remember, on April 7th would be the bios. Get those in before that time. And if there's nothing new,
Is there anything we should know about what's going on with the Tumwater thing? I mean, our joint meeting, I haven't gone through one of those, so all I know is it's a joint meeting and
It's a joint meeting because we're doing the joint plan. So it'll be a presentation by staff about updates to the Tumwater Urban Growth Area Plan. And back in the olden days, we'd all get in the same room 152 and sit around really big tables, and staff would present. And I think the City of Tumwater staff will probably lead the presentation. That's sort of tradition that the city sort of takes the initial lead on what they want to see in the joint plan updates to the urban growth area policies and planning documents. So that'll be what to expect. You'll all be in the same big Zoom with your fellow planning commissioners from the City of Tumwater and their staff and our staff.
Are we going to be asked to make decisions?
I didn't hear the question.
Are we going to be asked to make decisions?
No, I think this is an initial briefing, and you can ask all the questions you want and express any, concerns, need for more information. We can always schedule a follow-up, either joint meeting or individual planning commission meeting to address those questions before you'll set a public hearing and all of that.
Jennifer, is there any homework material we should go over before that meeting?
It should come to you prior to the meeting. So that would be next week, I would imagine. So a week prior.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks staff again for making me look good. And we are adjourned at 8:33. Good seeing y'all. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.